Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. It's been a while since I've said that. I took a little bit of time off because actually I filmed this video, Instinct and Intuition, and then I think I even edited it. But then I thought I had some nagging doubts that I hadn't. Everything about intuition isn't covered in those three books that I've read: Time and Free Will, Matter and Memory, and Creative Evolution. So I didn't post it, and I took some time off to read everything that Bergson has written. And there's still one book left that I haven't read, a collection of essays that I haven't read. I forget what it's called actually, but I've read everything else, and I thought it was important before I do this video in particular, just to make sure that I have this idea of intuition down correctly, because I make some claims in here that I really just wanted to make sure I was 100% right on, and I'm glad I did take the time out actually to read some of his other stuff. There's a lot that he says about intuition actually in a collection of essays. I think they're essays that he wrote in the early 1900s anyway, after Creative Evolution I think, but I think up until about 1925-ish. So from 1908 or something, around there till 1920, 20 something. There's a collection of essays. That's what the creative mind is, and there's quite a bit about intuition in there. So it was definitely profitable to have to go back and make sure I covered them. It meant I'm kind of radio silence for about, how long has it been? 6 weeks? 7 weeks? I'd hoped it would only be a couple of weeks, but these things never last the length that the duration that we think they're going to. So anyway, this video is about instinct and intuition, and it will start with instinct. So in the last video 13, we looked at the intellect. We saw that the intellect was practical. It was all about manipulating things, controlling things, using things, which meant that it was abstract. It abstracted things out of the continuous whole. It abstracted static, discrete entities out of the whole, which allowed us to manipulate them and use them for practical ends. So the intellect was a departure from movement, from change, from the new, from creativity. In short, it was a departure from life. Instinct is the exact opposite of this. So instinct is an unthinking harmony with life. Bergson describes it somewhere like that, probably in Creative Evolution. But yeah, so it's the exact opposite of the intellect. It places us right back into life itself, the movement of life, what life, that kind of impetus that we've talked about, and we will talk about later, that impetus that defines life, that movement forward, that is captured in instinct. And instinct, he says, simply carries out further the work by which life organizes matter. It's just life doing its thing, which is useful for us because we want to understand life. That's what we're looking at grasping here, that what life is, what the universe is. It's this dynamic, continuous whole, and in trying to understand it, if we take instinct, if we look at instinctual behaviors, that gives us a window into life itself, because it's a complete harmony with life, instinct. So he tells us to think of the bees of a hive forming a system so strictly organized that no individual can live apart from the others beyond a certain time. How can we help recognizing that the hive is really, and not metaphorically, a single organism, of which each bee is a cell united to the others by invisible bonds? So a nice description there. Bees, they're driven by instinct, so they completely embody life. They're, in a way, they're like life made incarnate. They're that impulse that we're trying to understand, that dynamism that characterizes life, brought to life in front of us, in a way, made incarnate, embodied completely in these insects. So they're the current of life in material form, which means that we can understand life by looking at them in more detail, by seeing how they work, what their behaviors make them do, or what their behaviors are, what instinct makes them do. And it's nice to compare the hive, or the bees in the hive, to cells in a body, because that's exactly what Bergson's getting at. The bees are not individuals. They seem to be separate individuals, a collective. The hive is just a grouping of these individuals, but in actual fact, the connection is tighter than that. They're not individuals capable of living on their own. They have to be a part of that whole. The whole is primary. The whole is more important than the individuals that make it up. And the individuals are parts of that whole, in a way that they're so inextricably connected to that whole that they can't live apart from it. So they're not separate at all. We have to think of them like cells in a body. All the cells in a body work together. They all work, they function for the whole, which is the individual, the body that they're a part of. And their actions, their behaviors, the things that they do, they make no sense on their own. We have to consider them only within this greater totality, which is the body. And the same thing here. The actions of individual bees can't be understood on their own. They only make sense when we take into account the hive itself. And really, that's what Bergson's saying about life, the universe. It is a hive, and all of the entities that it appears to be broken up into are actually parts of this whole, connected in a way similar to the way that these bees are connected to each other. They all function in harmony. There is a kind of a global harmony at the level of the whole. And then that's really where all of Bergson's philosophy is driving, to this idea that the whole is where we understand, is where we can understand the parts as they really are, as they function as parts of this whole. We can abstract parts of them out, and that's what we do. That's what the intellect does. That's how we manipulate things. That's how we use things. Because before we can use them, we have to apprehend them as discrete things, right? As separate things separate from the whole. But that's just an abstracted picture. If we want to understand everything, which is what Bergson is about here, that's what metaphysics is for Bergson, that understanding of the whole, then we have to look at it in this way. So Bergson also talks about instinct as a theme that cannot be expressed in an idea. It cannot be encapsulated in a concept. It must be felt or lived rather than thought. And this is precisely because it is life. Instinct is life, and life is experience. So we can, this is just something that I've said again and again throughout this series, right? Duration, we can't enclose it in words, in language. We can't completely describe it, because language always fixes concepts. It always operates with concepts. The intellect comes into this. That's how it analyzes. But duration, life, is precisely the opposite of that. It's a continuation. It's continuity. It's change. It's movement. These things are dynamic, and that's precisely what fixed concepts, static words, can't capture. But, of course, that doesn't mean that we just have to throw our hands up and say, "Oh, well, we can't say anything about it. It's an absolute mystery," and kind of gesture towards it as if like it's some kind of transcendent being. We can represent these concepts in thought. We can represent life, movement, change in thought and in language, but only incompletely, only inadequately. It's never going to be a perfect fit, the words that we use. There's always going to be, it's just not quite a match for what we're trying to explain. But that doesn't mean that we can't do it. We just have to understand the way that we're using the words. We have to understand the way we're using our concepts. And I think I've talked about that before. But yeah, so instinct is the same idea, because it is life. Life kind of incarnate, if you like. Another example Bergson gives when it comes to instinct, is of wasps paralyzing their prey in order to lay their eggs in it, I guess, in the caterpillar. And so what happens is some species of wasp, they have to immobilize their prey. In order to do that, they have to sting the caterpillar. It varies by different species, but sometimes, I think I remember Bergson, the highest number was 13. So a wasp has to sting 13 times in very specific spots in order to fully incapacitate its prey. And then the question is, how is this possible? How is it possible for the wasp to do this? Because it doesn't know what it's doing, right? It doesn't know the anatomy of the caterpillar. It doesn't realize that if it stings here, it's going to immobilize this. If it stings there, it's going to do that. So we have this puzzle to explain how a wasp is able to act in this way through instinct alone. And obviously evolution is part of the answer here. Bergson's not denying evolution, and we'll talk more about this later, but evolution is, I think, any sensible theory here of life has to include evolution. But the problem is that evolution doesn't give us, it gives us kind of the formal explanation, if you like, which must be true, which that's the power of evolution as a theory. If all of the conditions hold, you get evolution out of it. It's kind of inevitable, and that's the power of it as a theory. But here, so we've got the wasp performing the specific action, not having any knowledge of what it's doing. If we're trying to explain this, Bergson says it can't be understood from the outside. So we can't understand the way that what the wasp's doing by imagining the way that we would look at the prey with the intellect, with our knowledge of the prey and what each sting will do, which means that then it can only be understood as a kind of sympathy between the bee and its prey. And that is, we're not denying evolution. We're not looking at something different from evolution here, but there is in evolution a sympathy between these two. And that's the failure, I think, of evolution as a science, is that it takes things as discrete parts already and then tries to work with them. So it works fine. Of course, evolution as a theory is untouchable, but it's missing something. It's missing that impetus. It's missing that drive forward, which is what life is. It doesn't take that into account, which means you get a kind of mechanical picture of the universe, of evolution. Just randomly, this thing happened and it turned out to be beneficial. So the next generation also had that trait, and eventually it spread to the whole. But it all starts from a random mechanical change, and that, I think, is where I think Bergson as well would deviate from the party line of evolution. Evolution is 100% true. There's no way it can be wrong. As a theory, as a formal theory, it's airtight, I think. But the problem with it is, like I say, it can't explain this without just appeal to kind of a brute force attack, if you like. It's just throw a whole bunch of behaviors together and see which ones survive, and whichever ones survive, it'll just be a purely random, just depending on which behaviors happen to best fit the environment. But it's already splitting up everything into parts. It takes those parts as fundamental. It starts from the abstract. It doesn't start from the whole. And that's what Bergson's doing. He's trying to get beyond that, beyond the point where we have the wasp and the caterpillar, to look at the point where we have the wasp and the caterpillar as a system, as a whole, as a totality, as two parts of a greater body. The same way that you can't think of the two bees as separate. They are, and they only make sense within the whole, within the hive. And that's what Bergson's angling at here when he says that we can only understand this behavior through a kind of sympathy between the bee and its victim. And it is evolution. This is not anything different from evolution, but it's just, like I say, it's reaching further back than evolution does. It's going, evolution kind of starts too late. It starts once you've already broken the whole into parts, and we want to understand the whole first, and that will give us a deeper understanding of the parts, which are only abstractions, which aren't the real, if you like. So he encourages us to think that the knowledge the wasp has might owe nothing to outward perception, but result from the mere presence together of the Ammophila and the caterpillar, considered no longer as two organisms, but as two activities. It would express in a concrete form the relation of the one to the other. And that's a nice quote there. We can best understand the wasp and the caterpillar not as two entities, not as two separate independent entities, but as two activities in one whole. And that's the metaphysical truth here. They are not broken first. They're not broken apart first. First, they are parts of a whole. They're parts of a system. And when we come along, we see them as two separate things. But that's it's not incorrect. It's true. But if that's where we start our explanations from, we're never going to fully understand the whole, because we're like I say, we've already broken the whole into parts. Now, when we try and understand how those parts fit together, we get an answer, an explanation that doesn't quite fit. It doesn't quite gel with the way things are. And so I really like this. It's a powerful idea, I think, this notion of comparing two separate things, apparently separate, as parts of a whole, the same way that two cells are actually parts of a body. And again, if you think about it, you try to understand the actions of a cell in my hand and the actions of a cell in one of my fingers, you can make a story. You'll be able to make a story about how and why these different cells are doing what they're doing. But if you start from the premise that they're completely isolated, that they're separate and independent, you're not going to get the proper picture, because in order to understand what the cell in my hand is doing and the cell in my finger is doing, you have to see that they're both operating within a human body. And when you have that bigger picture, then you can see that what they're doing can't be understood on its own, can't be understood isolated. One cell's activity, the activities of one cell can't be understood isolated from the activities of another. They only make sense when we tackle them together. So that's brilliant. It's also open to a little bit of mystical abuse, I feel. So this is something that I always push, right? I don't think there's any scope for mysticism or religion or the supernatural to come in here, or Deepak Chopra's quantum woo-woo, well, we're all entangled, we're all connected at a deep level, so telepathy must be real, or my actions affect you in some way, blah, blah, blah. That kind of thing, I think, is it's an extension of this idea that is I think, completely illegitimate. The fact that the cell in my hand and the cell in my finger are parts of a whole and that they work together doesn't mean that the cell in my finger can communicate directly with the cell in my hand in some magical way, because they're actually parts of a whole, right? And so there's no ground for any kind of supernatural or mystical influences here. There's nothing magical about two bees in a hive. Right? We don't have to impute any kind of mystical connection that they might share, or any way that they can, transcend time and space in some way, because they're actually they're entangled in some way, or, so I don't think we need to go there. It's kind of, the door opens, it cracks open a little bit with this way of understanding the universe, but I think we ought to keep that particular door closed when we're doing philosophy anyway. Okay, nice. So that's instinct anyway. Let's turn to have a look at intuition. Right, so intuition, in fact, everything I'm going to say about intuition is going to be taken from creative evolution and the creative mind. And there's a reason for that, which I'll come to at the very end of the video. But he talks about this word intuition in the creative mind, one of the essays in there, and he says that the use of it has led to a lot of confusion. And it's almost certain that the word, that confusion continues into today as well. I think using the word, unless you've really read quite a bit of Bergson, if you've just heard the idea intuition, I think straight away you'll be off on a tangent of, religious / mystical / supernatural kind of leanings, which really is not what intuition is about. So half of this video, half of this section, I'm going to try and dispel that, and the other half I'm going to basically explain what I think Bergson means by intuition. So we'll start with a couple of quotes. The first one is this one. To think intuitively is to think in duration. Intelligence starts ordinarily from the immobile and reconstructs movement as best it can with immobilities in juxtaposition. Intuition starts from movement, posits it, or rather perceives it as reality itself, and sees in immobility only an abstract moment, a snapshot taken by our mind of a mobility. Intelligence ordinarily concerns itself with things, meaning by that with the static, and makes of change an accident which is supposedly superadded. Okay, so that's nice. That's the difference between the intellect and intuition. And intuition, the important part of that is the very first part of that quote. To think intuitively is to think in duration. So intuition is essentially thinking along the lines of duration, thinking in terms of duration. And he also talks about intuition as installing ourselves in the phenomenon we wish to understand. So whether it be change, movement, life, an individual, a body, whatever it is we're trying to understand, intuition involves installing ourselves in that thing and placing ourselves in it through an act of the imagination. And that's what the quote that I've got here. Philosophizing consists in placing oneself within the object itself by an effort of intuition. And that's from Introduction to Metaphysics. So we want to get ourselves into the thing. And that sounds like opening the door to, a meditative insight or something. I'm going to close that door very firmly in this next section when we look at what intuition is not. So, 3 things intuition isn't. First, it's not a feeling. And it's certainly not a gut feeling, which is how we might tend to think of intuition these days. I had an intuition that something just wasn't right. So it's like a gut feeling, like a hunch, that kind of thing. Not at all what Bergson's talking about. These kinds of things, I think, those kinds of intuitive insights, there's scope there also to think of them as to put kind of a mystical slant to those as well. But in fact, I think that kind of intuition is perfectly explicable by unconscious cues, body language, or your past experience, or your unconscious kind of ruminating on something. If you meet someone and you just get this feeling that they're dishonest, and later it turns out to be true, we tend to jump to, oh, there was some kind of magical something happening. Probably not. Probably, there were subtle body language cues that you picked up that you weren't consciously aware of. Maybe this person reminds you of someone that you've known who was dishonest, or whatever it is. I think there's perfectly prosaic explanations on offer for that kind of thing. But anyway, that's not what Bergson's intuition is. And I found this quote which was quite nice to capture this. To say nothing of the kind of person who would insist that my intuition was instinct or feeling. Not one line of what I have written could lend itself to such an interpretation. And in everything I have written there is assurance to the contrary. My intuition is reflection. But because I called attention to the mobility at the base of things, it has been claimed that I encouraged a sort of relaxing of the mind. And that's a really important quote, because so first we have, it's not feeling. He's not talking about some kind of feeling you had, a hunch that you had, that you got. And he also says, gives us a positive spin, my intuition is reflection. And we'll come back to that later. So it's not a feeling. Intuition is also not a meditative insight or anything like that. It's not something that kind of hits you from out of nowhere when you are in an altered state of mind. That's not what intuition is. So like closing your eyes and drifting into a meditative state, that's not intuition. Trying to become one with the universe, to somehow in some mystical way harmonize with the thing that you're thinking of, whether it be another person or the nature of the universe or whatever. None of these things are what Bergson's intuition is. So that kind of cuts off that Buddhist path, which you might have thought was kind of open here with intuition. It's nothing to do with altered states of consciousness or flashes of inspiration. And the third thing it isn't is it's not a divine revelation, and not necessarily divine, not just divine in the sense that it doesn't come from a god, but it doesn't come from it's not something implanted in you from outside. It's not an external thing. It's not something which is kind of you're not picking up something from outside you. You're not tapping into the energies of the universe or anything like that. Nothing like that. So intuition is not a feeling, it's not a meditative insight, and it's not any kind of revelation. You're not tapping into any kind of the currents of the universe or whatever else you might think you're doing with intuition, or you might think you're doing when you're meditating or something, for example. So that's what intuition isn't. What is intuition? The way I've kind of organized this, I've just grouped, I've made kind of seven categories that we'll go through, or 7 features, characteristics of intuition, which I hope will clarify it once we get into them. So first, intuition is unclear. It's nebulous. It's hazy. And he describes intuition as a vague nebulosity around our conceptual thought. So it's not something that's going to be precise. And that's inevitable because of what the nature of what we're dealing with. We're trying to understand life itself. We're trying to understand the whole. And this, it cannot be understood through analysis. Analysis works with parts, not the whole. doesn't work, it breaks down at the level of the whole, right? But intuition gets us to that whole. It lets us understand the whole. So if we're going to understand the whole, we're not going to be able to make use of the precise tools that the intellect has at its disposal. We're not going to be able to quantify, to measure, to take advantage of concepts that perfectly encapsulate what they're talking about, because those things work only at the level of abstraction when we're talking about the parts, not when we're talking about the whole. So it will never be clear, it will never have distinct boundaries, but this is not a negative thing. It's just the nature of the object we've chosen to investigate. Right? It's just what it is to look at the whole, to look at life, to look at change, to look at duration, to understand these things. We can't make use of those tools of precision which the intellect has. So it's necessarily unclear. Second thing, it's simple. And intuition is always going to be simple. It grasps its object immediately and completely. And we can contrast this with analysis, which never ends, right? It's an infinite movement, because whenever you try and break something down, you'll always be able to break it down into smaller parts, no matter what it is. If you're trying to analyze the movement of your arm, and that's the example Bergson gives that I'm thinking of here, you've got the movement of your arm understood from the inside. It's nothing could be simpler, right? The arm moves from here, from this point to that point. It's as simple as anything could be, understood from the inside. But if you want to analyze it, if you want to break it down, then we run into basically unsolvable, irresolvable complexity. So you've got your arm starting from here. In order to get to here, it has to pass through all of the points in the middle. But there are an infinite number of points in between, right? We can break the route that it has to travel. My arm has to travel from point A to point B up into infinite parts, the trajectory. So how is the arm able to cross that? It doesn't make sense if you look at it through the tools, through the intellect. If you try and analyze it, it becomes an infinite task, because, like I said, there are an infinite number of points. That's Zeno's paradox. But understood as a movement from within, I move from A to B, nothing could be simpler. It's as simple as that. But when I try and break it down, when I try and analyze it, when I try and understand it according to the intellect, and that is to say, when I try and understand it from the outside, looking in on it as from a third person perspective, then it becomes, well, it's kind of a mystery. There are an infinite number of things going on, even, right? I mean, I can even break down the things that have to happen in order for my arm to move, the signals that have to be sent from my brain to my arm, and the way that my arm has to coordinate as it moves, and all the muscles have to tense and work in harmony, and we can continue to drill down deeper and deeper in any one of these things, and we find that we're kind of opening Pandora's box, because each facet of that movement can be analyzed infinitely. We can just keep analyzing. We can just keep breaking it down, right? And there's no end. and yet the movement itself is unbelievably simple. There is nothing simpler than that. So intuition grasps its object immediately and completely in a single simple apprehension. And what follows is the philosopher trying to explain that intuition. And that's where the complexity builds, because they have to use words to explain it. And then once that explanation is out there, then it's not quite right, so they have to use more words to tweak it. And then that's not quite right, they have to use more words, and then this is misunderstood, so they have to use more words. And you can see the process. Bergson talks about this as well, actually, in The Creative Mind, the way that every philosopher, he says, every philosopher worth reading has only one good idea, one solid intuition, and everything else that they do is to explain that intuition, which is infinitely complex, because you can break it down, like I said, into as many different facets as you like. You can tear apart a simple intuition and draw inferences and draw consequences and draw, you can get a lot out of that single intuition. But that's the driving force behind a good philosopher anyway, according to Bergson. I quite like that idea. It is a nice idea, actually. Heidegger says something similar as well. What does he say? I think he says he connects it with repetition. You have one good idea, or one idea. His idea was being, and everything else that he says, everything that he says afterwards, is just an explication of that idea of being. Everything he says turns around being, and he revisits that idea again and again. That's repetition. But every time he comes back to it differently. And the second circle is different from the first one, even though it's a repetition of the same idea, being. Comes back to it again and again. And each time it's a repetition of the same idea, but it has more with it. It's approaching the idea from different directions. It's looking to. It's just always kind of circling that key idea. Bergson's Heidegger talks about that as well, which is interesting. Suspicious. He got that. I don't know how much of Bergson Heidegger read, if any, but some of the parallels between the two are suspicious, to say the least. Anyway, so intuition is unclear, it's simple, and imagination is a key part of it. That's the third point. Imagination is key. So the way that we put ourselves in the phenomenon that we're studying, the way that what I talked about earlier, installing ourselves in the thing that we're studying. So the way we do this through, it's an act of imagination. And Bergson says in Introduction to Metaphysics, I am in harmony with these states and enter into them by an effort of imagination. So it's not when I talked about installing ourselves in the thing, putting ourselves into the object we're trying to study. That's not a mystical way of talking. It's not code word for going into a trance and tapping into the underlying truth of blah blah blah. It's just imagination. It's using your imagination to get behind, to get into the thing that you're studying, with that idea of duration in mind. So with the idea that you need to understand this thing through movement, through change, through continuity, not through the fixed categories that the intellect deals with. So imagination's key. And in Introduction to Metaphysics, Bergson talks about, he gives an analogy of knowing a character in a book. The novelist may multiply traits of character, make his hero speak and act as much as he likes. All this has not the same value as the simple and indivisible feeling I should experience if I were to coincide for a single moment with the personage himself. The actions, gestures, and words would then appear to flow naturally as though from their source. So we don't know the character through an accumulation of descriptions. We don't know, we do get to know the character through an accumulation of descriptions, but the way that we can best come to understand the character is not through these descriptions, which would have to go on forever in order for us to really come into sync with the character, in order for us to really get a feel for them from the outside. The descriptions, they would have to be infinite in number. You could never adequately describe a character from the outside such that I could understand it totally. But I can get that complete understanding of this character through having read about him or her in a variety of situations, and maybe we can say getting a feel for what that person would do or say. So there's kind of a colloquial term, getting a feel for something. And again, there's nothing mystical about that. Getting to know a character is just, you've just read enough about this character, you've seen how they behave, and you can imagine what it's like to be their character. You can put yourself in their shoes. That's what intuition is. It's putting yourself in the shoes, not of another person, but of whatever it is you're trying to study, whether it's, we're talking about life, we're talking about movement, we're talking about these kinds of things. We're putting ourselves in the shoes of these things through an act of imagination. And this, by the way, is also how I think of primary and secondary sources when I'm reading philosophy. I'm sure I've talked about this before, but in case you don't remember, in case I haven't, I'm not a big reader of secondary sources, just because it really is. It has the sense. I have the sense when I do that, I don't get to know the writer themselves. I don't fully grasp the philosopher when I read a secondary source. It's like, it's like a third person. It's trying to understand something from the outside, never quite able to really get a hold of the ideas. But when you read the primary source, and so I'm a big advocate of reading primary sources, when you do that, you really do get a sense for what Sartre is thinking, what he would say if you were to say, how he would respond to this kind of question, or what Bergson's really getting at when he talks about this. Reading secondary sources is great, but you never get deeper than that kind of superficial third person external viewpoint. But when you read Bergson himself, it really is. It feels like you're installed in Bergson. You're getting something much deeper than when you just read what someone else has read or said about him, like me. So actually, even though I do these videos, I always recommend you read the primary sources. These videos, no book will ever be a substitute for creative evolution itself. And even, I'm not going through the books kind of chapter by chapter, but even when I do that, like I usually do, because I really want to delve into the details, I always recommend you read the book at the same time, because just listening to me rant and rave, it really is, it's kind of superficial at the end of the day. No matter how much I try and explain, it's never going to be worth what it is in the pages of the book that I'm talking about itself. So yeah, anyway, but that's a good example actually of intuition, just getting into the thing itself, installing yourself in what it is you're studying. So that's done through intuition. The fourth point, it's done through imagination. The fourth point, the fourth thing about intuition is that it is a different way of thinking. And I'm just going to give you a quote, and then we'll break this down. Whether it be intellection or intuition, thought, of course, always utilizes language. And intuition, like all thought, finally becomes lodged in concepts such as duration, qualitative or heterogeneous multiplicity, unconsciousness, even differentiation. So, whether it be intellection or intuition, thought, that very first part of that quote there, intuition is not an alternative to thought. We're still thinking when we're using intuition. It's still thinking. It's not another sense. It's not another sensory mode, right? And again, this is another stumbling block that I think is very easy to get tripped up on when you're thinking about Bergson's intuition, because we do think of it as this extra sense. You know, I got this intuitive insight. It didn't come from any of my normal senses. It's like the sixth sense. There's that sense, there's that feeling that's what it is. That is not what intuition, Bergsonian intuition is. It's just thought. There's nothing, it's not anything other than just normal thought. Whether it be intellection or intuition, thought is what we're talking about here. So what it is then, and also remember from earlier the quote from the very beginning of this section, my intuition is reflection. So it's a reflective activity, intuition. It's not anything other than just thinking, but it's thinking in a specific way. It's thinking in a particular way. It's thinking with those ideas of change, of movement, of continuity, of essentially thinking in terms of duration instead of in terms of analysis, in terms of the intellect, in terms of concepts. And that's all it is. It's just a different way of thinking. And what it means then, the difference that it's going to make the difference here is we're going to use metaphor and comparisons instead of logic and measurement when we're describing our intuitive insights. And like I've said before, that's just because those concepts, or rigid concepts, measurements, quantitative analyses, they don't work when we're trying to describe the whole. They're only useful for the parts. So we're going to have to, when we talk about intuition, we're going to have to resort to metaphor. We're going to have to resort to comparisons. But each metaphor that we use will highlight a different aspect that we're trying to show of intuition, or of duration, or of change. And so that's the way that we use language. So we're still using language, we're still thinking. It's just that we're using it in a slightly different way. We're appealing to, in a sense, we're kind of holding the words open instead of letting them close in around their meanings, around their concepts. We're using the words, we're using the concepts, but with the understanding that these words and concepts remain open. They remain fluid. They have to be understood in a different way than if we were analyzing something. So that's the fourth feature of intuition. The fifth is it's rigorous. It's still rigorous. I don't have a good quote for this, and I don't remember Bergson saying intuition is rigorous, but I this is what I see in Bergsonian intuition. We're not abandoning clear thinking here. We're not. It's not like anything goes now, and if it seems like, or if you feel like something, then it's true. We're not opening the door to this kind of, like I said, divine inspiration, or a sudden flash of inspiration you had while reading some text or whatever. There's still philosophical rigor behind intuition. So the idea is not to indulge irrationality and abandon evidence. Bergson, for example, is always tying his theories to science, to evidence. He's always trying to connect what he's talking about to the sciences, right? He's not offering kind of off the wall theories that don't have any connection to science. He's always tethered to science, to the concrete. So we're not indulging, we're not heading down the path of superstition or mysticism here. We're just trying to see the situation. We're trying to understand the object without the categories of the intellect. Seeing in a way that is not following a hunch or indulging some irrational fantasy, but thinking in terms of duration. And an interesting analogy I thought of with this, which I think applies here, is Einstein and his beam of light. When he came up with relativity, he asked himself, what would it be like to ride on a beam of light? What would I see? And when he did that, what you'd normally expect, right, is if you're following the way that we understood the universe at the time, was if you're riding on a beam of light next to another beam of light, and you looked over at that beam, what would you see? You'd just see a static beam of light, right? Because both beams of light are traveling at the same speed. But the insight that Einstein had was that even if when I looked at this beam of light, we're traveling at the same speed, I would see the beam of light next to me racing ahead of me at precisely the speed of light, even though I'm also traveling at the speed of light. That was his insight, and that's what led to relativity. So when he did this, when he made this intuitive leap, he didn't abandon clear, rigorous thinking and fantasize, some kind of outlandish religious or supernatural story about beams of light and how fast things travel. But he abandoned preconceived notions and instead imagined something different, intuited what it would be like, intuited that riding on this beam of light, you would see another beam of light moving away from you at the speed of light. So that's kind of the way I see intuition here. It's still rigorous. It's still rigorous thought. It's not anything goes. It's not the doors aren't flung open for any old theory or anything that you can come up with. We still have to tether ourselves to rigorous thought, but we're looking beyond the categories of the intellect. We're looking beyond fixed concepts. We're looking to think in terms of duration. So that's the fifth thing. The sixth feature of intuition is that it is practically useless. It doesn't help us live within the world. It doesn't help us achieve anything in the world. It doesn't help us do anything that we need to do. That's what the intellect is for. The intellect helps us. The intellect is practical because the intellect deals with the abstractions from the whole. It deals with the things, the objects. It helps us. It's what allows us to manipulate them because it lets us see them in the first place. It lets us grasp them as things, as the things that they are for us. So the intellect helps us live within the world. The intellect is practical, but it can't help us understand that world as a whole. We can't use those same concepts, those same categories of thought to understand the whole as the intellect uses to understand the parts. And so the opposite is true for intuition. Intuition gets us to reality itself. It lets us, a nice expression of Bergson's, hold reality in a firm and final embrace, but it doesn't let us live. It doesn't help us achieve any of our goals. So it's good for this kind of an understanding of the whole. But if you want to manipulate the whole, if you want to achieve your ends, that's where the intellect comes in. That's the power of the intellect. And the last point I have to note here is that intuition always comes first. And this was quite an interesting idea. One cannot proceed backwards to an intuition that one has not had. In other words, you can't deduce an intuition. The intuition comes first, and that lights the way forward for the intellect to go about its task of analyzing. So you have to have that guiding light of the intuition first. And that's what we talked about earlier. You have that intuition, and it's simple. It's always a simple idea. But when you try and explain it, you end up down a rabbit hole of twists and turns and complexities and convolutions, and because just the nature of trying to explain the thing, it always becomes complicated just because of the way we're trying to explain it. We're trying to explain it in terms of parts, when in actuality it's a whole. So we're always going to find ourselves always chasing down this intuition, always trying to better capture it, better describe it. But what that means is you have to have the intuition first. You have the intuition and then you analyze. You can't analyze something to get the intuition. You can't go from the analysis to the intuition. The example that Bergson gives is being given letters of a poem, but all jumbled up, all randomly mixed up. In order to put the poem back together, you need a guiding intuition of the whole before you begin. You have to have an idea of what the poem is before you can put the letters back in the correct order. And this is because, so if you tried to do it randomly, just that kind of brute force attack, it would be almost impossible, virtually impossible to do it. And the reason is that the letters are elements, not parts. So they are, and the distinction that Bergson makes here, elements are pieces of a whole, constitutive of that whole. They only make sense in the whole. They only make sense in relation to other elements which make up that same whole. Excuse me. Parts, on the other hand, they're independent. They're discrete. They're separate. They make sense on their own. They're abstracted out from the whole. So the letters here, they're elements, according as Bergson uses the word, they only make sense within the whole. And so they only make sense in their relation to other letters that make up this whole. And so that's a good way of thinking about this distinction, which I've talked about before. The bees in the hive, cells in the body, they're elements. They don't make sense understood as parts. Okay, so that is kind of my breakdown of intuition. I've got a couple more things to say before we wrap up. The first is just a point about intuition in life. So I'll give you a quote which we'll break down. Talking about intuition, by the sympathetic communication which it establishes between us and the rest of the living, by the expansion of our consciousness which it brings about, it introduces us into life's own domain, which is reciprocal interpenetration, endlessly continued creation. So the point that I wanted to emphasize with this quote was that life can only be understood through intuition. Intuition is the only way we can grasp life, through that simple, direct, unmediated apprehension. So life can only be understood through intuition, and intuition is only about understanding life. It's only useful for understanding the whole. Why? Because life is duration, right? And intuition is thinking in terms of duration. So we're just kind of reinforcing these ideas that I've mentioned before. There is an objection. What if you object by saying that, don't we always use intelligence? We're always using the intellect. We can't not use the intellect. It's just the way we work. How is it possible to get beyond it? Bergson discusses this in Creative Evolution, and he gives the analogy of swimming. He says, if you think about swimming, it seems impossible if you consider it rationally. Thousands and thousands of variations on the theme of walking will never yield the rule for swimming. Come, enter the water, and when you know how to swim, you will understand how the mechanism of swimming is connected with that of walking. Swimming is an extension of walking, but walking would never have pushed you on to swimming. That's a nice analogy, right? When you stand kind of at the beginning and you're trying to understand this process that we're talking about, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense according to the intellect. How can we go beyond the intellect? We're always thinking in terms of the intellect. We can't get beyond it. Come into the water, then you'll see. You'll get that intuition. You'll understand what it is to think in terms of duration. But if you analyze it from the start, if you before you even attempt it, you won't bother attempting, because it will always seem impossible. It will always seem impossible when you analyze it. It will always seem impossible to the intellect. So Bergson talks here of a leap, not a leap into faith. We're not leaping into this is not a hopefully it'll work, or hopefully God will help us out on the way, or whatever, or maybe I'll tap into the currents of the universe and get this intuition. It's not that kind of leap, but it's a leap in the sense that there's no step-by-step progression from reason and the intellect to life. You can't just follow a path that's laid out from the one to the other. The transition from the intellect to life, from thinking in terms of concepts and ideas to thinking in terms of duration, is a transition from the quantitative to the qualitative. And so And that is the leap, to go from the quantitative to the qualitative. You can't get there by adding more quantitative steps. You have to make a leap to a different kind of thinking, a different way of thinking. That like I say, you can't get to by just putting one foot in front of the other in the manner of logic or of reason or of intellect. So it's nice that that quote, swimming is an extension of walking. Both are forms of movement. And the parallel for us, intuition is an extension of the intellect. Both are forms of thought. But again, you can't get from the intellect to the intuition in the same way that you can't get from walking to swimming unless you come into the water. Okay, so that is intuition. That's all of that's everything I wanted to say about intuition. I just wanted to make give a caveat, not a caveat, but just a note here. You remember at the beginning of this section, intuition, I said what I've taken, what I've talked about here is from creative evolution and from the creative mind. So from that period of Bergson's philosophy. And the reason that's important is because in his later thought, and I'm thinking particularly here of the two sources of morality and religion, which was written in 1935, so very late in his life, he does muddy the water here a little bit, and he starts talking about extending intuition to mysticism, specifically Christian mysticism. And I haven't touched that at all, and I'm not going to touch it here anyway. I'll just say a couple of things about what he talks about in the two sources. Intuition kind of takes on for him a different. He's really talking about something completely different from what he's taught from the intuition that he was talking about in creative evolution in his earlier writings. The intuition, the way that it gets kind of transformed in two sources, is it's an intuition which it's not available for everybody. It's not philosophical intuition. It's not something you can really hope to engage in on yourself, because it's for only a few people. He likens it to genius when it comes to art. When it comes to art, not everybody is an artistic genius. You only get those rare individuals who are so have that way of seeing the object that they're able to capture it in paint or in sculpture or whatever. That's like genius level artwork. It's the same thing here with the intuition that he talks about and linking it to Christian mysticism. It's only available to those rare individuals like the Christian mystics who have had this apprehension of something beyond themselves, had this apprehension of the whole. And he talks about love a lot, and he talks about kind of just getting beyond the state of play in which we are warring with each other, in which we're kind of at odds with other people, or we're states at odds with other states, to getting to see this bigger picture in which we're all together, in which we're all participating in this grand project called life. And that's the intuition that he's talking about, getting an apprehension of that, having a sense, a felt sense of this idea that we are all parts of this greater whole. But this, like I say, the intuition that he talks about here now is only available to the rare few, the rare, not talented, but maybe the lucky or maybe the unlucky, depending on how you look at it, the few who are able to have this intuition. So it really, like I say, intuition takes a completely different turn, and it does kind of become something that you, something mystical, something supernatural, something religious. So does that negate everything I've just said here about how it's not mystical, it's not religious? I don't think so. And there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that I think Bergson himself is drifting from the course that he laid out in creative evolution, in the creative mind. I'm not drifting from the path of Bergson. Bergson's drifting from his own path, I think. So this is where I part company with Bergson in the two sources. And that's why I've left all of what I've said about intuition as I've said it, because I think that's truer to Bergson's original thoughts about intuition. And his later stuff, I think, in the two sources, I think he's gone off topic a bit. But read it for yourself. You can decide whether I'm right or if you think you want to scrap what I've said and follow Bergson into the two sources. But I will say as well, or let me give you a quote actually from the two sources, and then give you the other reason why I don't think it negates anything that I've said here. No doubt we are here going beyond the conclusions we reached in creative evolution. We wanted then to keep as close as possible to facts. We stated nothing that could not in time be confirmed by the tests of biology. Here we are in the field of probabilities alone. So in the two sources, he says there, right, he's gone beyond where he was with creative evolution. In creative evolution, we stayed with the facts. We kept with the facts. We kept with the facts of biology. We kept with the facts of the science, of physics. Intuition fit into that framework there. Now in the two sources, now he's going beyond into the field of probabilities. And this is something he really didn't do prior to that. He was quite careful about this, and the speech he gave about dreams, he also says there, he seems open to the idea that maybe there's something more, maybe the paranormal may be something that's worth investigating. But he says explicitly in it's a speech that he gives to the Psychical Society or something like that, British Society of something to do with the paranormal anyway. Psychical Society, that's what I keep getting. But he says this is as far as I go. Wherever you go from here, you can pick it up from here. But where you go, where you take what I've just said about dreams, that's your task. My task, the task of philosophy, brings us only to this point. Beyond here, I can't say. And in the two sources, he does say. He decides to push it beyond. But, and this is the other reason why I think what I've said is valid, is it's clear that he is extending the idea of intuition into Christian mysticism. It's not intuition as he had it laid out for us in creative evolution. It's, in a sense, it's even something quite different, a different kind of thing. So I think everything I've said about intuition, I stand behind, even though I think Bergson eventually carries intuition further than I'm prepared to. But I'm not with him on that. It pains me to say I have to part company with the man himself in the two sources. I was really disappointed actually when I read two sources. The first half is brilliant. It's just classic Bergson. It's excellent. And then the second half he starts talking about religion, static religion, and he breaks religion into two, static and dynamic religion, and the dynamic religion gets his kind of stamp of approval. And yeah, he starts playing with words like God and love and you know, all these kinds of, there's nothing wrong with love, but kind of adding metaphysical overtones that I don't think are warranted. So anyway, I part company with him there. You can take what I've said and take it or leave it. Make your own decision on it. But that's where I stand on it anyway. Summary time. Right, so first we looked at instinct, and we saw that instinct is an unthinking harmony with life. It's just life made manifest. So instinct, in fact, shows us life itself. Then we looked at intuition. That was the main focus. A couple of definitions to start with. Intuition is to think in duration, think in terms of duration, think in terms of movement, change, continuity, instead of static concepts. It's also to install oneself within the phenomenon, within the thing that you're studying. So those are some decent definitions, I think. Then we looked at what intuition is not. It's not a feeling. It's not a gut feeling. It's not a hunch that you get. It's not a meditative insight. It's not something that comes to you through an altered state of awareness or some kind of, you know, flash of insight that you get while in meditation. Nor is it an external revelation. It's not something that you tap into. You don't get this by unlocking your hidden potentials or anything like that. The 7 features of intuition that I pulled out in this video: haziness. It's unclear, and that's because we're not using intellectual categories. It's simple. It grasps its idea immediately and completely. Complexity comes when you try and explain that simple idea. It uses the imagination, and this is how we install ourselves within change, how we install ourselves within the thing we're thinking about. We do it through an active imagination. Not an active imagination, an act of imagination. It's also a different way of thinking. So think about the swimming analogy compared with walking. It's still movement. It's just a different kind of movement. Intuition is still thinking. It's just a different kind of thinking from the thinking that we do with the intellect. So that means that intuition is still rigorous. It's rigorous thought. We're not abandoning reason. We're not abandoning kind of clear thinking. We're not indulging irrational thought. That's I think the main thing. And my example there was Einstein, his intuition of riding on a beam of light. I think is a good example of how intuitive thinking works. it's practically useless. It has no value for us in living our lives. It doesn't make our lives any easier. It doesn't help us achieve our goals. It gives us an understanding of the whole rather than the parts. That's all. And it's prior to intellection. You can't work backwards to an intuition you've not had. You can't deduce an intuition from an analysis of the parts. You can't deduce the whole from an analysis of the parts, really. So the intuition comes first. And finally, we looked at later Bergson and the way that he extends intuition into Christian mysticism, an idea which I'm not very taken with, to put it lightly. But like I said there, I don't think it negates anything that I've said about intuition in this video. And I think a lot of what I've said comes straight from an earlier phase of Bergson, and so in a sense I'm just remaining true to early Bergson, not late Bergson. And it's not really right to talk of earlier and later Bergson. It's not like there was a big change in his thought, the way that we talk about like early Heidegger and later Heidegger. But still, there is that difference in intuition and that kind of drifting into mysticism, which we won't follow him, the path we won't follow him down. And that is everything I have to say. This is, I'm not sure how long this video is. I know it's long though, but I don't know, what can I say? There's just so much to talk about. Hope you got something from that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching as always, and I will see you in the next video.